This reading is part of a continuing series designed to acquaint listeners with some of the historic literature on hunting, fishing, and wildlife in the lower Mississippi Valley South of the 19th and early 20th centuries. If you find it worthwhile, please hit the like button, subscribe, and visit our website, Canebrakes.com. On the Sunflower River, Forest and Stream, November 3rd, 1892. We three tenderfeet had been honing for a bear hunt for some time, so about the 1st of November we left Indianapolis, bound for the Sunflower River in Bolivar County, Mississippi. We arrived in due time at the little station on the New Orleans Railroad, about 110 miles south of Memphis. The town consisted of a saloon, 2 general stores, a sawmill, and several small dwellings situated in a heavily timbered country. We were strangers in a strange land, but the people were kind and obliging, and in answer to our inquiries informed us that deer, turkey, and small game abounded in the immediate neighborhood. But if we wanted bear and panthers, the best place to find them was up the Sunflower, some 25 miles on Black Bayou. As an evidence of good faith, we were shown a half-grown cub at the saloon fastened with a chain, and the stuffed hide of a panther over 9 feet long, both captured on the Sunflower. We also were regaled with some panther stories that were calculated to make us feel a little shy on the panther question. For instance, the boss of the sawmill said he was cutting timber with a gang of men back in the woods a few weeks before, when one morning early one of his men had occasion to go out in the cane, when a large male panther sprang from a leaning tree onto the back of the man while the latter was in a squatting posture. The weight of the animal bore the man to the ground, and he cried out for help, but before it arrived the ferocious cat had killed him with one crunch of his powerful jaws, breaking the poor fellow's neck. Another man told us he was hunting squirrels with a shotgun when passing through a heavy piece of timber where the cane was very high and thick. He saw a large panther on the side of a tree in the act of climbing up it. Without waiting to think what the consequences might be, he fired both loads into the panther back of its shoulder and killed it. This was the same panther whose hide we saw at the saloon. After hearing these stories and many more, we came to the unanimous conclusion that we hadn't lost any panther, and if they would let us alone, we would remain strictly neutral on our part. But we were determined to have a bear, panther or no panther. So after laying in the supply of provisions, we hired a man to haul us and our plunder over to the Sunflower, some 6 miles away. Arriving at the river, we bought some lumber at a sawmill and soon built us a flat-bottomed boat 18 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 1 foot deep. We caulked it with oakum, bought at Cairo, and pitch from the mill, and made it as dry as a powder horn. And after fitting it with rowlocks and seats and with oars and rudder, we launched her on the placid bosom of the river. While we were engaged in building the boat, 2 young men who lived nearby, both of whom were mighty hunters before the Lord, promised to take us with them on a bear hunt. So one morning bright and early we started, the hunters each mounted on a pony, while we brought up the rear afoot, accompanied by 11 hounds of all ages, sizes, and colors, but each and every one equipped with a deep bass voice. Our route led us through the dense timber and heavy canebrakes of the river bottom. Every little while one of the younger dogs would go off on a deer trail, which performance always called for a great deal of cussing from the natives. But the old dogs knew their business and kept close behind the ponies with preternatural gravity depicted on their countenances. After a couple of miles we came to a cypress swamp where bear tracks were plenty and fresh. The cypress knees were torn by the bears and the great cypress trees were raked and scratched by them where they had stood on their hind legs and clawed down like a cat. We saw where they had torn the bark off the trees 10 feet from the ground. Unmistakable evidences of a big 'un. All of these signs made us tenderfeet feel pretty dubious, as we expected the war to begin any minute. Finally, one of the old dogs struck off on a trail, baying at every jump. The natives said it was a bear sure, and that old Lead, all good hounds are called Lead or Drum, would soon overtake the bear. After a chase of perhaps 20 minutes, we could tell by the sound that the bear was brought to a stand, and we set out with the hunters to where they said the bear was. Sure enough, when we came up, there stood the bear, with his back to a large tree, fighting off the dogs, when one of the natives killed him with his rifle. After skinning the bear, they put the meat in large sacks made for that purpose and hung to the saddles, and the hunt was over. The next morning, we started on our 25-mile pull up the river. The water in the stream was quite low and clear, about 100 feet wide. The banks were from 15 to 25 feet high, and the cane grew to the very edge of the bank. Doc and I each pulled an oar, while George steered. Our progress was slow, as the current in some places was quite swift, but the greater part of the way was dead water. 5 miles from the mill, we left the last cabin behind us and were in a dense wilderness. It was our first introduction to a country where for 25 miles on either side no human being lived, where no stock was running, and where every track was that of some wild animal. The first day we saw no game except ducks and squirrels, but in the afternoon of the next day, and only a mile or two from where we intended going into camp, we saw a bear in the river getting a drink, but before we could get our guns, he had scampered up the bank and into the cane. We had the pleasure of gazing on his tracks wet with water that had dripped off him. We saw 2 more bears swimming the river some 300 yards away, and looking for all the world like big Newfoundland dogs, with just their heads out of water. We fired several shots, some coming pretty close, but didn't hit them. The river bank was literally clawed down where the bears climbing up the banks would leave the marks of their sharp claws in the soft clay. We finally came to where a small stream ran into the river, and knew from the description we had received that we had reached our destination, and began looking about for level ground enough to put up our tent. This was no easy matter, as the banks generally rose direct from the river 25 to 30 feet. But fortunately, we did find a level place just large enough for our purpose, and better yet, close by a spring of clear water, strong with iron and sulfur. Our tent came so near occupying all the level ground that we could almost step from the front door onto our boat. After putting up the tent, getting a lot of firewood, and cutting enough cane from which we stripped leaves to make our beds, and then getting supper, we were so tired that we went to bed as soon as it was dark. We were awakened the first night by hearing some large animal falling or rolling down the steep bluff just back of the tent. It was too dark to make any investigation till morning, even if we had cared to do so. But as soon as the daylight appeared, we could see the tracks of a large bear where he had scrambled back up the hill. For the life of us, we couldn't see how the bear came to fall down the bluff, but he had fallen, for we could see where he had torn up the dewberry vines in trying to catch himself as he came tumbling down. We had been told that there was a lake back from the river about 3/4 of a mile where we would be sure to find game, so we determined to cut a path through the cane to it. The cane was very thick and from 10 to 20 feet high, and impassable for anything in the shape of a man. But several years before there had been an attempt made to drain the ditch, and by crawling on your hands and knees up the old ditch bed, it was thought possible to get to the lake. After several hours' hard work, the rider succeeded in reaching the lake, which he found to be a bayou about a mile long and 100 yards wide. The water was deep and clear. Large cypress and oak trees grew on the margin of the lake, and a strip of tolerably clear timber, some 50 yards wide, extended around it between the cane and the water. I began cutting a path with my hatchet in the direction of the camp, while George cut toward me. By hallooing occasionally, we could tell just where each of us was at, and finally came together about halfway between the lake and camp. We now had a good path direct to the hunting ground, and felt like we had done a good day's work. The next day we set out to explore the lake. We found plenty of bear signs. They had beaten a path around the lake, and in soft places we could see fresh tracks made that morning, as large as my hat, while the ground under the persimmon trees looked like a lot of hogs had been there. This began to look interesting to us, and we expected to have a bear fight in about a minute. Doc and George went up, while the rider went down the lake. The wind was favorable, and I kept my eyes peeled, expecting every minute to run foul of a bear, and sure enough, just beyond the thicket I heard one walking in the edge of the water. The brush was so thick I couldn't see him, but I heard him come out of the water and begin turning over logs hunting for worms and rooting around like a hog. About this time I became pretty nervous and thought the track was getting pretty fresh, but knew it would never do to back out now. So I began crawling through the thicket toward the bear. I must have got within 50 yards of him when he heard me and went galloping off into the cane, making as much noise as a yoke of cattle and beating down the cane as thick as my wrist with his heavy body. My experience convinced me that the only way to get a shot at a bear would be to find a good place where they would be likely to come for water and wait for them. So I found where a large tree had been blown down into the lake, with its body some 10 feet above the water, and crawling out as far as I could get, found I had a good view of both sides of the lake for 100 yards. I could see great numbers of fish in the clear water directly under me, while flocks of ducks swam up and down within 10 yards of me, unconscious of my presence. Gray squirrels were numerous and tame. They would come close to me and didn't seem to care who or what I was. But on the other side of the lake, a large fox squirrel, something rare in that country, in hunting for grapes, spied me out and began making a terrible fuss about it. I thought sure that squirrel would kill himself barking. He would bark till he turned black in the face and would run up and down a large grapevine, jerking his tail and cussing me for everything he could think of. I have sat perfectly still at the root of a tree and had deer walk up in my plain view within 20 feet without seeing me. But you can't hide so the sharp eyes of a squirrel won't find you out. While seated in my treetop, a large otter came swimming by. I could have shot him easy as not, but didn't want to lose the chance at a bear. I waited till it began to grow dusk and went back to camp, where I found the boys. They had had no better luck than I. Saw plenty of sign, but no bear. About 100 yards above the tent, a large drift had formed in the river, and George said he believed he would go there and try for a channel cat. He cut a dry cane about 15 feet long and baited his hook with a piece of squirrel liver. In a few minutes I heard him calling for help, and running up to the drift found he had hooked some kind of large fish and couldn't get him out without help. We finally landed it when it proved to be a beautiful channel cat of at least 12 pounds weight. We found it no trouble to catch all the bass and salmon we wanted. In fact, the river seemed to be full of fine fish. While George and I were fishing, Doc went back to the lake to kill some ducks. About sundown we heard him calling for help and firing his gun. When going to his relief, we found him wandering up and down the lake, completely lost. The wind had blown the cane down over the path where it left the lake, and Doc would go past it every time. We finally got scared and thought he would have to climb a tree and wait for morning, or else make bait for bears. One day George took his stand near the edge of the lake, and after waiting patiently a while, a large bear came out of the cane and began drinking at the lake, not over 75 yards away. George was a good shot and could plug a squirrel in the head nearly every time, but the sight of the bear rattled him so that he fired too low, and the bullet struck the ground just under the bear. This scared the bear worse than the bear scared George, and he jumped several feet in the air and was soon out of sight in the cane. After this, none of us could get a shot at a bear, although we had no trouble to get all the deer and turkey we wanted. We watched the lake and the river patiently for a week, and finally gave it up, loaded our baggage in the boat, and floating down the river to the mill, shipped it to the railroad, and came home. We gave it as the result of our experience that the only successful way to hunt bear is to hunt them with dogs trained for the purpose. One can still hunt for deer and turkey, and in our opinion that is the true and most sportsmanlike way to hunt deer. But he can't do much good in hunting bear that way. Their sense of smell, sight, and hearing is so acute that the chances are 10 to 1 that the bear will discover you before you do him and make his escape. On our return home, I had the pleasure of meeting and dining with Mr. R. E. Bobo, who owns a large plantation near the small station on the railroad named for him. Mr. Bobo has a large pack of the very best bear dogs and is an enthusiastic hunter. In 1879, he personally killed 304 bears, 52 wildcats, 47 panthers, and 66 deer. Who can beat this record? Signed, C.C., Rushville, Indiana. If you enjoyed this story, you may like to read more about R. E. Bobo and other old Delta characters at Canebrakes.com. You may also enjoy the books offered there, including The Bear Hunter, The Life and Times of Robert Eager Bobo in the Canebrakes of the Old South, and Hunting Bear in the Old South, the writings of Dr. Henry J. Peck of Sicily Island, Louisiana. And please do hit the like button for this video and subscribe. Thank you.